and tremendous success, whatever everybody needs. We're going to do with Hashem's help today's Chumash. We haven't recorded. I was in Ukraine last year, I believe, so we don't have this Chumash recorded. So we're going to record it now. We're missing the first few days, and Mitzvah Hashem together. We're holding Parshas Re'eh, the second Torah portion, actually coming from Israel. This is very fascinating. The first 350 years that the Jews lived in Israel after they entered Israel with Joshua leading them, they actually had the Mishkan in three places: Nov, Givon, and in Shiloh. And there was a non-permanent, fully permanent structure. And at some point, we'll see in today's Chumash, King David said, how right is this, that we are building permanent structures made out of stone and so on, and we are not building Hashem's house, a permanent structure. And there they went to build. King David reached out to the prophet at the time, Shmuel, and he says, we got to build a permanent structure. So the Jews knew for those 350 years, since Moses told them in today's Chumash, actually, they knew that there was going to be a place where that will become a permanent home, but they did not know where. So here we see Hashem describing the future permanent place that will take place. Let's see that together in chapter 12, verse 11, today's Chumash. And it will be that the place that God will choose, and nobody knows where. And we know it's going to be in Yerushalayim. And nobody at that time knew, as Rashi says here, that Hashem was waiting till King David will come. And what will happen? Why all of a sudden will things flip in the times of David HaMelech? Because peace will come to the Jewish people, because King David will wage war against all the Jewish enemies, and he'll create peace among the Jewish people. And now it will be time for the Beis HaMikdash to be built. And King David will approach Nasan Hanavi. I said before Shmuel, it was Nasan Hanavi, and he says, I'm sitting in a house of cedars, and here we have Hashem's home in a tent, in a house made out of tarps and so on. And it's time to build the permanent Beis HaMikdash. Hashem is here telling Moshe, saying there will come a time which Hashem will choose this permanent location. When that happens, the Shakin Shmoi Sham, that his name will rest upon that location. You'll bring everything there that I command you. I can't help but mentioning in my mind as I'm reading this verse, what I'm thinking is that maybe that's what we're waiting for today. In order for the Beis HaMikdash to be built, we need to have peace among the world. It can't just be built. We need Mashiach to come, which will bring peace in the land of Israel, and then it'll be time for the Beis HaMikdash to be built, perhaps. Just a thought that's going through my head. Anyway, when you will come there, you will bring in that new location in the temple in the Beis HaMikdash in Jerusalem, which we now know where it became. You bring your alesechem, your burnt offerings, v'zivchechem, and your peace offerings, ma'asrei sechem, your tithes, the 10% that you need to bring to Jerusalem with trumas yadchem, your separations, and all your choice vows which you're going to vow to Hashem. You'll bring them all to this new location, to this Beis HaMikdash. Now, let's just read the other Rashis here. Rashi tells you that the earlier verse, which we spoke about, the earlier location before the temple, that was referring to the Mishkan as it existed in Shiloh. Shiloh was for very long, over 300 years, it existed in that location. And after Shiloh, Shiloh was destroyed at one point, and then they came to a new city called Nov for a couple of years. The Mishkan was there. When that was destroyed, they went to a place called Givon, and during that time, when it was destroyed, they were allowed to bring sacrifices in their own backyards and create their own altars and so on, or in their town squares, wherever it was. They were permitted to build certain kind of altars, but as long as they had a structure, somewhat permanent structure, everyone had to go to that shul. Imagine having like a shul for certain things. You could only go to the main shul, and so on. And they have to bring the best, he's saying. The verse is also telling us that it has to be the best of all sacrifices. You should rejoice before your God. You should bring all the tithing and the sacrifices and rejoice with Hashem in the location he will choose. You should do this pilgrimage. You and your children, your sons, and your daughters, your male servants and your female servants. Make sure to also have the Levites with you. Why is Hashem saying it's so important to include the Levites in your tithes and your sacrifices and everything else? Because the Levites themselves are not allowed to invest. They're not allowed to have property and real estate. and have farming, because they are not allowed to have a portion, because as we said earlier in the Chumash, we're going to say it again later, that Levi's job is to teach the Jewish people. So make sure the teachers of the Jewish people have also rejoicing when you're going up to rejoice with everything Hashem gave you, make sure the Levites are with you. Or the Sachab Chomakam Eshartiya, you have to be very careful, he says. It's a very strict prohibition, he says. It's a negative commandment that you're not allowed to just build any altar anywhere you want, in any place that you want. You have to build only in the Beis HaMikdash, only in the temple. That's the location where it has to be. Unless, and Rashi says, there's going to be exceptions in history, which Hashem will make an exception and allow a prophet to come and say that God told him a prophecy that there can be a possibility of a time which God will want you to bring a public sacrifice, not in the temple, and that will come in the time of Elijah the prophet. We're going to learn this in our letter, actually, the Rebbe, in our class today at Yehuda, at Get Furniture. We're going to learn about this interesting time when there was a king called Achav, and Achav, with his wife Izebel, caused a lot of Jews to serve idols. And at some point, Elijah the prophet said, make up your mind, choose. Are you with God? You can't choose both. You have to choose one. A lot of times the problems in life is people want to choose both. Are you for Hashem or you're not for Hashem? Make up your mind. It's either or. Either you're with the idolaters or you're with the prophets and the sacrifices to Hashem. And over there, Hashem will allow Eliyahu HaNavi to choose a sacrifice, to bring a sacrifice outside the temple. So sometimes Rashi is saying it could be allowed that God will make an exception. Ki'im, but otherwise, the makom at the place, you're only allowed to bring it to the place, Asher Yivcha Hashem, that God will choose, only that new location that God's going to choose. That's where it has to be, which we know is going to be Jerusalem. Now, where will that location be? He's giving him some clues. It's very interesting already. It will be in one of your tribe's areas. And now, which tribe is that? Many people make a mistake. They think it's in the tribe of Yehuda, because Yehuda has the whole southern section of Israel. And people think that the temple is built in Yehuda's section, but it's not true, because Yehuda, right on top of Yehuda, was a tribe of Benjamin, was a tribe of Binyamin. And a little slither of Benjamin went into Yehuda, and that little slither, which was Benjamin's property, was where the temple was built. So a little sliver of Benjamin's property went into Yehuda's real estate, Yehuda's property, and that is where the Beis HaMikdash was built. So it was built in Binyamin's property, in Benjamin's property. So he's saying, the verse is telling us here, Be'echad Shvatecha, in one of the tribe's lands, Sham Tale L'Secha, over there in that location, you'll bring your sacrifice. V'sham Tasa, Kol Asher Nechim Tzaveka, and over there you'll do everything that I command you, all these sacrifices, and everything I'll be commanded will be in Jerusalem. That will be the holy location. Now Rashi says that in another place we see it says, earlier it says, Hashem will choose it from among all the tribes. All the tribes will be included in this location of the holy place where it will be. So it's a complication here. On one hand, this verse is telling us that Hashem will choose it to be in one of the 12 tribes locations, one of the tribes, and we know the tribe is Benjamin's. On the other hand, it seems to be a public, something belonging to all 12 tribes. So the answer is that when they will come to purchase that specific plot where the Temple Mount was on, David will purchase it and buy it from a threshing floor from a man called Arnon, who was the Jebusite. When they purchase that specific property within the Binyamin tribe, they will take money from all of the Jewish people to purchase it, and therefore that land, the specific temple, although being in Benjamin's tribe, it really will be owned by all the Jewish people. It's kind of like Washington, D.C., where, I don't know, it's in whatever state Washington, D.C. is in Maryland, I think, but it also has its own unique state, so it's not part of any state. That's kind of, I guess, maybe somewhat similar to that is how Jerusalem is bought and purchased by all the tribes. Now, he goes to a very interesting point, because where he talks about sacrifices and then eating meat in general. By the way, so here comes the source, one of the main sources where it's permitted for us to eat even meat. Because until then, actually, in the desert, as Rashi will say, they were not allowed to eat and meat. They only could eat it through sacrifices. So only if you brought a sacrifice were you allowed to then possibly eat the meat of that sacrifice. So all animals that meats were eaten were brought first to Hashem as a gift. So he's going to talk about now when that what if you're not bringing animal as a sacrifice? Can you eat its meat? And that will continue learning along this topic as we're discussing Jerusalem and the sacrifices that have to be brought there. We're also going to discuss not eating the fats, not eating the blood, and when are you allowed to eat the meat of an animal? Rak only. If your soul desires, if you want, and Rashi is saying something very interesting here. It's telling us that we know already. Rashi says that you're allowed to eat meat. Torah allowed it elsewhere. We're going to learn more details soon. That you're allowed to eat meat. We're going to see it in verse 20. So what is it telling us here? We're going to discuss those details of just eating meat if it's not a sacrifice, that a Jew is allowed to eat meat. Here he's talking about even if you had an animal that was a sacrifice, there's a way for it to be disqualified, and then all of a sudden you're allowed to be able to eat its meat. How could that ever happen? That you have a sacrifice that's holy and has to be treated with tremendous holiness, that all of a sudden one is able to actually eat the meat of the animal, and that is if the animal got a blemish. So once that animal that was supposed to be a sacrifice got a blemish, and a permanent blemish, not just one that like could get healed the next day or within a couple days or so on, but a permanent blemish that won't go away, then that animal becomes disqualified for sacrifice, and now you can eat it just like any meat of a non-sacrificial animal. Let's see inside. The chalta basar, you can eat its meat. As Hashem has blessed you. So all animals you have, once they got a blemish, Hashem has blessed you to become very rich. And now you have all these animals and you bring all these sacrifices, and some of the animals got blemishes on them. You're allowed to eat its meat. Now, it's not that animal. Rashi also tells us, as the verse is saying, it's not just free for all. Once an animal was designated as a sacrifice and then got a blemish, okay, you're allowed to eat it just like regular meat, but you can't do whatever you want with it. As Rashi says, "V'chalta basar," what you could do is eat its meat, but you cannot start shearing its wool. It has a level of holiness. You can't start now, as a big business, I guess, was back in the day, because they would shear the wool of the animal and keep it, or they would even milk it. No. Once that animal was designated as a sacrifice, even if it got a blemish, you cannot shear its wool, you can't take the milk from the animal. All you could do is slaughter the animal and eat its meat. And it loses its retention of holiness, which means that when an animal is holy, it has to be eaten with a high level of holiness. Now let it be impure. Don't worry about it. This animal, once it got the blemish, we're not concerned anymore. Holy, not holy, even though it was once a sacrifice. Once it got a blemish, you can't bring to God sacrifices with blemishes. It's not respectful. So this animal, A, you're allowed to eat its meat, and B, it's lost its holiness, and therefore you can eat it on your kitchen table with impure stuff together. Tzvi ka'ayil, just like a tzvi, deer, a ka'ayil and a gazelle. We know deers and gazelles cannot be a sacrifice. They're not brought in the temple. Deers and gazelles are not. They're kind of wild. They're not tame animals that people keep in their yards. They're wild animals. Just like they don't have a level of holiness, you could just eat them, make hamburgers out of them, eat them wherever you want. It doesn't matter if you're impure or pure. So too, once the sacrifice got a blemish, it doesn't matter if they're pure or impure. Also, another point is, what's unique about these wild animals, they're kosher animals, but they're wild animals, a deer and a gazelle, is that unlike other sacrifices, you have to give a donation from each of the sacrifice you brought to the kohen, right? You'd have to give the zroya, part of the leg, and the cheek, and the breast meat of the animal to the kohen. These gazelles and deers and deers are exempt because they're not sacrificial animals. They're not brought on the altar. They're more wild animals. Now, continuing to learn about the laws of meat. So, okay, good. So we discussed that if you're bringing a sacrifice, you got to bring it to the temple. But if the sacrifice got a blemish, all of a sudden you can eat its meat, and so on. But there are other rules regarding this. Rak hadam lo yisei. You should not eat the blood. Now, what does that mean about eating blood? And this is a big part, by the way, of Jewish meat today, because Jewish meat tastes different than the non-kosher meat. And if you go to ShopRite, they taste very different. Why do they taste different? Because Jewish meat has to be soaked with blood, because we have to make sure all the blood of the animal is out of the animal. That's why we salt it. So he's telling you, originally, we know one of the reasons you can't eat blood is because the blood has to go on the altar, right? That's part of the service. So blood is holy, the soul's in the blood. The blood has to be sprinkled on the altar. Okay, so that's why I'm not allowed to eat the blood. But then you might say, well, that's only a sacrificial animal, that the blood has to go to the altar, I'm not allowed to eat the blood of that animal. Well, what happens if it's not a sacrificial animal, like the animal we're talking about now that got a blemish? I can't sacrifice it anymore. And therefore, the blood of the animal is not going in the altar. So begs the question, can I eat the blood of such an animal? So he's telling you now in the verse, no animal, you can't eat blood of any animal, even if it's not a sacrificial animal, that its blood is going on the altar. Don't eat its blood, even though it's not brought as a sacrifice anymore. What should you do with the blood? You should pour it on the ground like water. What does he mean with this idea of pouring on the ground on its water? I believe, if I understand correctly, that a deer and a gazelle don't need to have covering of its blood. It's not commanded. I guess when we slaughter the chickens, and I'm not sure which animal and what. Certain animals, we know we have to cover the blood. When you slaughter it, you cover it on the ground. There's a commandment to cover the blood of the animal. But these animals here, you're not commanded to cover its blood. I'm not sure which one, actually. I'm not sure if it's referring to the tame animals or the wild animals, but the bottom line is, you're not commanded here, this animal, to cover its blood. Number one. Number two, he's telling you that the blood is like water in a certain sense, that water has the capability, going into a whole different set of laws, and I won't get into it now, but if a fruit has a liquid that goes on it, it makes it now prepared to become susceptible to impurity. I don't want to get into the whole topic now, but the blood also is similar to that kind of liquid, that if blood goes on it, it makes it also susceptible to impurity. Let's move right along, verse 17. Continuing along with these laws, because remember, we're talking about the temples being built. You're not allowed to eat these sacrificial animals that are used for sacrifices in your own gates. In other words, you're going to move around Israel, different locations. And if you want to bring a sacrifice, you're not allowed to eat it, certain things, in your own area. In other words, it has to go up to the temple. Once Jerusalem is selected, you must eat it and the temple's built, you must eat it within Jerusalem. Meiser, the Gancha, including what is included in eating in Jerusalem? The tithe of your grains. We know people have tithe their grains. You have to give 10% to certain years. You have to bring it up to Jerusalem. You have to eat it only in Jerusalem. Or people would exchange the money of that and then go buy stuff in Jerusalem. You need it there from that 10%. The tithe of your wine and your oil, and also the firstborn animals that go to the Kohen. The Kohen can't eat it anywhere he wants. The Kohen has to eat it in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem. So once that location is selected, as we're studying in our today's Chumash, it's a very important location because all these things have to be done over there in Jerusalem. The firstborn of your cattle and of your sheep, and the different promises that you make of sacrifices to bring them, and the donations that you're separating by your hand, which is the first fruit that grow in your property. All those things need to be brought into Jerusalem and eaten over there. Once that area is selected, it becomes very important and very necessary to know the location and eat the fruits in that new location that's chosen. You have to eat it before Hashem inside the wall. So I guess there's a wall around the old city of Jerusalem. In that wall, you must eat these different obligations once that location is chosen. Eat it in that place that Hashem chooses. You, your sons, your daughters, your servants, your male servants, and your female servants. And remember to include the Levites with you. It'll be like a party. You'll rejoice with Hashem, your God. With all the things that Hashem will give you. So come, bring your riches and your success, the tithing and the sacrifices and so on. Bring in and rejoice before Hashem, and make sure to include the Levites with you, and either give the Levite his first 10% donation you need to give him, and if that's not enough for him, he doesn't have enough to rejoice because the 10% is not enough for him, give him the second tithe that goes to the poor people, because now he's poor, you're responsible to take care of the Levite. And if you don't have even a tithe enough of the poor man to support the Levite, then give him of your peace offerings. Take some of that meat that's going for you in Jerusalem and make sure he's included in the party that you're having in Jerusalem. Include him in the simcha. You're going to rejoice with Hashem with all the success that you've got, and make sure he's a guest at your table. Be very careful that you forget about the Levi. all your days are alad masecha that you're on the land. So not just is there a positive commandment to take care of the Levi, there's a prohibition to forget about the Levi. You're going to go and enjoy and celebrate with Hashem, and Hashem, I guess, going to be like, what about the Levi who's teaching you, who's supposed to be your, taking care of the sacrifices and stuff, and you're not taking him together to rejoice in your holy times that you're rejoicing in Jerusalem. Now, Rashi says, interesting, this commandment is only when you live in Israel to take care of the Levite, actually. But out of Israel, if the Levite is lacking, there's not an extra mitzvah to take care of the Levi. There's a mitzvah to take care of all poor people, and the Levite is included in that, but there's not an extra mitzvah for the Levi. Verse 20. Yarech of Hashem, now we're going to learn about, till now we spoke about sacrifices, and sometimes sacrificial meat could be eaten in some ways as regular meat when it has a blemish, but what about just regular meat? What about just, can you eat regular meat? When God will spread out the boundaries of your land, you'll have a lot of land. Rashi says this is very important because somebody should not want meat only when he's rich. In other words, he's teaching you etiquette over here. The person should live within their budget. A person should have a healthy budget and live within their budget. When should you eat meat? When financially you're doing very well. So he said when Hashem expands Israel, and the Jewish people are successful financially, Hashem will spread out the land. Like he said that he will get Israel and it will spread out. And you'll say, oh, I want to eat meat. Because I have a desire to drive to eat meat. It's a lust, it's an enjoyment that a person likes. You can eat according to your desire. Here's a clear Torah telling us that we're allowed to eat meat. Now he's telling you that now you're allowed to eat meat, but when Jews were in the desert, there was no free eating meat. It could only be meat of a sacrifice. Animals that were killed had to be sacrificed to Hashem, and only then could you partake in parts of the peace offerings of those sacrifices. But when you come to Israel, he's telling you in the verse, no problem, you want to eat meat, eat meat. Now, you're going to be very far from Jerusalem. People will live all over Israel, especially those days that have cars. Imagine people lived all the way in the north. People live far south of Jerusalem. And now the problem is you can't bring, let's say you want to maybe bring a sacrifice and eat the meat, but you don't live close by. So it's not like you could go every day to the temple and sacrifice the meat and eat it, but you have the money and you have the desire to eat meat. So when you live far away from the place that Hashem will, far away from Jerusalem, the location where Hashem will choose to put his name there, and you will slaughter your cattle and your sheep, you'll slaughter them halachically according to all the regulations that are necessary for slaughtering. Now, very interesting here. The Torah does not teach us, there's a lot of rules. I've actually taken that course on learning the ritual slaughter, halachic rules, how to slaughter. The Torah doesn't teach us anywhere these rules. These are all passed down in oral tradition, but it does make mention that there are these rules. Look what he says here, when you will slaughter your animals and follow the way that Hashem told you to not kill them with a gun, to do the ritual slaughtering way that Jews slaughter animals. Asher nasan Hashem that in the land that Hashem gave, like he commanded you orally, because we don't have this written in the Torah. This is another evidence in the Torah that in the written Torah, implying that there is a written Torah. You'll eat it in your gates, according to every desire of your soul. That again, you're allowed to eat it, no problem, but you follow the laws of shechita, of ritual slaughter correctly. And just like you eat the gazelle and the deer that are not sacrificial animals, you're allowed to eat their meat. So too, you could eat you could eat other animals that can be brought as sacrifices, but you don't have to bring them as sacrifices. You can eat them pure and impure, which means there's a very high bar set for ritual sacrifices. You have to eat them only in impurity. But if they're not ritual sacrifices, you could eat them without impurity. Now, so they're similar. The sheep, cow, I don't know, whatever animals, goats, which could be sacrificed, but you're not bringing them as a sacrifice. It's okay. It's fine for you to slaughter them ritually and eat them wherever you are. However, there's a difference. There's a difference. The wild animals, the goat and the deer and the gazelle, their fats are allowed to be eaten. However, a animal that could be a tame animal, which could be brought on the altar, then it's prohibited for a Jew to eat the fats of these animals. So he says only there are some similarities between non-sacrificial tame animals to the wild kosher animals, but there are also some differences. Similarities are that if they're not brought as a sacrifice, you could eat them also impure. The difference is those wild animals, their fats is permitted according to Jewish law, but the tame animals that could be brought as sacrifices, their fats is prohibited for you to eat them. Tell me, but you could eat them pure and impure, just like the gazelle and the deer. So too, the tame animals, you could eat them even in impurity. Rak chazak, however, be strong. Do not eat the blood, even though the blood is not being sprinkled on the altar, because they're not sacrificial animals. Do not eat the blood. Why? And the Torah even tells us why. Why is a Jew so prohibited from eating blood? Because the soul of the animal is in the blood, and you don't have a right to eat the soul. And you're not allowed to eat the animal while it's alive, which is another prohibition. I'm giving you permission, Hashem says, to eat the animal. Follow the ritual laws, but also make sure the animal's dead. There's no life in it, there's no soul in it when you eat it. Because in those days, unfortunately, maybe they wanted the meat to stay fresh. They would make a surgery, cut off the foot of the animal and eat it, and then cut off another foot the next day. And Hashem's saying, you're not allowed to do that. The first animal has to be dead. You can't eat it while it's still alive, rip off a limb from it, which is how lions, devour their prey. They won't wait till it's dead. They'll start eating it right away. But we accept that we have a rule that you have to wait till the animal's dead. But don't eat the blood. There's a very interesting Rashi here. Rashi says that it says, be strong. We don't often find this in the Torah. Be strong and do the mitzvah. Be strong, and guess what? Don't eat the blood. Now, why would you have to tell me be strong and don't eat the blood? So number one opinion Rashi brings of Rabbi Yehuda, he says this is obviously implying that people love blood. They were these kind of people who love to devour blood. And therefore the Torah is telling them, be strong, don't devour blood. And it's not like people today who are grossed out by eating blood, but people used to like it. They were these kind of cannibalistic kind of people. So it's telling you, be strong and don't eat blood. However, Reb Shimon ben Azi disagrees and he says, no. He says that people were disgusted by blood. Well, then why does the Torah need to tell you, be strong and don't eat blood? He's telling you that even if you don't like it, you should still be strong. And the message here is very powerful. If you have to be strong, not to violate a prohibition, which anyway you don't want to do, could you imagine the prohibitions which you're lustful to, which is intimacy and what was the other one he said there? For other prohibitions that a person wants to do, for sure, you could only imagine how strong you have to be to make sure to not violate it. So in other words, if eating blood, it tells you to be strong, which you don't like, he's saying, for sure the mitzvahs which you do, the violations which you are lustful to do, you have to be even stronger not to do them. Don't eat them, don't eat the blood, and the blood should be poured on the ground. So the veins, the blood that's in the veins that are squeezed out of the veins, at the end, while the blood's coming out, that blood's prohibited to you. And even more blood. Verse 25, don't eat it, even if the blood is in the limbs, is saturated in the limbs, within the limbs, those are also prohibited. And Hashem will bless you tremendous blessings. And your children after, when you do the correct path of Hashem. And here, this is where I was actually mentioning something before. If Hashem is blessing you for doing something which you're not interested in doing, like blood, anyway, you don't want to do, and Hashem gives you tremendous blessing for following the mitzvahs. You can only imagine. For stealing, it's very easy when people want other people's money and prohibited relations, and Hashem will bless you. Could only imagine how much Hashem will bless you for keeping those. However, your holy offerings, those are not allowed to be eaten anywhere you want. You have to bring all sacrifices to the temple, to the Beis Hamikdash, to the place that Hashem will choose. All sacrifices have to go to the main shul. And you'll bring your burnt offerings, which are totally burnt, which means the blood and the fats, the meat have to go on the altar. And when it comes to the peace offerings, you don't have to put the meat, just mostly the blood. And you could eat the meat yourself. The blood gets poured on Hashem's mizbech, but the meat you could eat. Now, Rashi says two other things about these sacrifices about them. That if you take a sacrifice and you exchange it for another animal, when it's not supposed to be exchanged, now both animals have to be become holy, and that second animal has to be brought to the altar. Another rule, he says, what happens if you had an animal you designated a sacrifice and then that animal had a baby? It was a female animal and that had a baby. Guess what? That baby is considered a sacrifice too. You have to you have to bring the baby of that animal as a sacrifice also because its mother was holy. And finally, if you made a sacrifice outside Israel, you got to make sure also to bring it up to Eretz Yisrael. It has to come to the place of the Hashem Shul, to the base of Mikdash. Shamar, you should guard. What does it guard these mitzvahs? What does that mean? Learn the oral Torah, Rashi is saying here, because you have to guard it. You have to review the Talmud and review the law, because if you don't, you're not going to know how to fulfill it. You're not going to act. The Jew needs to sit and review his Torah study and learn, especially the oral Torah, has to remember it. When you review your study, you will listen and you'll be able to do all these things that I command you. And Rashi says he's telling you here that you shouldn't have, small mitzvahs and big mitzvahs. All mitzvahs should be the same equally. They're small just as a big one. So that Hashem will make it good for you. And your children forever, and forever. I want to focus on these words here, teach a lesson from it that Rashi doesn't bring. Why will it be good for you? Because you will do and act in a way that's good for heavens and also in the eyes of man, and you will keep the mitzvahs. Now, that's the last verse. I just want to share something on this verse. I remember when I learned this, finally I had some clarity that listen what it's saying. Do what's good. Hashem will bless you because you're doing what's good in the eyes of God and the eyes of man. It's a very important verse here. People might think that I need to do what's good in the eyes of Hashem. What do I care what other people think about me? They see me sticking my hand in a pushka, they'll think I'm stealing. They'll see me going to McDonald's, maybe I'm eating a soda. People might look like I'm eating something not kosher there. You might say, I don't care what other people think about me. I need to live my life that I know what I'm doing is right. Why do I owe it to other people? But look what he says here. You should do what's straight and right in the eyes of God, and the hayashar also straight in the eyes of man. So it's important for us to live our life not as if we're doing corrupt, evil things and the people around us think we're doing bad. Only Hashem knows good. We have to make sure, even in the eyes of man, we also look like we're doing what is right. And that is the end of today's Chumash class. I know it's already 1 o'clock, so we'll leave it over here. Any questions or comments?